Welcome back. I'm now going to touch briefly on categorization and coding, but more as a general topic than as a how-to. Keep in mind that we're going to talk about this much more in our in-class workshop and our reading, so this lecture is really just meant to introduce you to the topic. As I was explaining in the last lecture, qualitative data analysis is a lens that allows us to see our data more clearly, but after we examine our data, we need to find some way to group them together. One approach we can use is called categorization, where we place data into different thematic categories or buckets, and then we can also use something called coding, where we apply some sort of meaning, usually in the form of numbers that are tied to a code book, to our data so that we can analyze it in different ways. And the basic idea of coding is to transform data into these highly structured indices or categories or themes, often by assigning ideas into numerical codes. Why would we do that? Well, first of all, it allows us to prep the data and put them into a format that can be used for other forms of analysis other than simply reading and trying to make sense of what's said. But also we can apply multiple layers of coding. We might want to apply a sentiment analysis, for example, where we're looking at are people talking positively or negatively about the thing that we're asking them about. Are they bringing up certain keywords that we're looking for? Are they bringing up certain topics that we're looking for, or themes that we're looking for? So you can actually, with one piece of data, actually have several different layers of coding that you can apply to it depending on what you're looking for. And so that's one of the big strengths of that approach. Categories are a little bit simpler because categories usually involve fracturing the data into pieces and then just kind of putting things into buckets depending on where they go. And categories are probably easier and more intuitive for people who are already familiar with the data to read and understand than coding, because coding can get quite complicated and quite abstract. But the downside of categories is that they usually don't offer a real sophisticated level of analysis, and they usually require a pretty good contextual understanding of what's going on with the data. So when I talk about these two terms, they are different. They refer to different things, but they're often used interchangeably because they often are used together. So even though they have different ways of dealing with the data and approaching them, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about coding and categorization as being kind of the same thing. So another part of the problem that we run into is that there's really no single method that serves as a standard for how qualitative data are coded or categorized during analysis. Everybody does it differently. And depending on how and where you were trained, you may have an approach that's very different from mine, but equally valid. And in fact, in this lecture series at the end, I'm going to have 3 different videos about 3 different styles of coding that can be done or categorizing that can be done. So I think what's more important is to understand why we do it and what we're hoping to accomplish with it. And one example I often use to explain all of this is putting away holiday decorations after Christmas. So in my house, we have several different types of holiday decorations that we put up every year, and we've developed a system for putting them away that makes sense for our purposes, so that we'll understand where those decorations went when we want to get them out next year. But to anybody else, it probably looks a little bit like madness because it makes sense to us because we're the ones that use the decorations. But if you were to find these decorations and try to figure out why we put them in the containers we put them in, it might not make any sense to you. So first of all, we have a variety of ornaments that go on the Christmas tree. And even though those vary in shape and size, and they might even vary in terms of material and all kinds of other things, they all have a similar purpose. They're going on the Christmas tree, so they get put away together. The same is true for the items that go on our fireplace mantle. Garlands, lights, stockings, and even a lamppost all go in the same box because we know that they all go in the same place when we put them out, so we want them to be together so it's easier to get them out and easier to put them away. But then we also have garlands and lights for other places in the house. And even though those other places are all in different locations, they have a common purpose. They don't go in the living room with the tree or with the mantle, so they get put in their own box together. We also, as you have seen behind me, have Legos all over my house, and we have a ton of Lego displays that we put around the house around Christmas time, Christmas Legos, and we put all those away in one container because they're all Legos. So we want to make sure all the Legos go together, even though they're made for other places in the house. And then we also have our outdoor decorations, which get sorted depending upon which sorts of decorations they are and where they go in the yard. Categorizing all these kinds of decorations into storage containers, of course, requires us to have a lot of prior knowledge about what we're going to use them for. So if we wanted to make things even easier on ourselves, we could use some stickers and code them. We could put color codes or we could put number codes or whatever made sense in order to understand where they go and what they're used for. We could put a sticker on each item with a number corresponding to its container, and we could even include a second or third sticker with additional codes that remind us of what the items are used for or what room they belong to. This would allow someone who wasn't familiar with the context or history of the decorations to still be able to work with them to put them up and put them back away. So for an outside person, that coding system actually might be more helpful than our normal category system. And that's really what coding and categorization do for our data. They allow us to understand where things fit together and for what purposes. Categorization is simpler and it's a little bit more intuitive, but it also requires a contextual understanding of our data. So it works well for an inductive framework where we're looking for similarities and frequencies of similar themes, or a deductive framework where we're applying what we know to a group and trying to group our data according to our pre-existing theory. Coding, on the other hand, is more complex and it could add many additional layers and dimensions to our data, but its strength is that it allows someone outside the data analysis process to be able to utilize the data. In an inductive framework, we might use coding to tag similar categories or sentiments or keywords. In a deductive framework, we might have codes that are already constructed that we're using to apply to our data to see if we have sufficient support for our theoretical understanding. So if you're still with me after all of that, what I want you to know now is the type of code you assign depend heavily upon the aims of your analysis. So this gets even a little bit more complicated because we have to think about what are we going to do with this when we're all done with it. Codes are often, at least start out, being directly descriptive of data. So they tend to reflect themes or categories, but they could provide thematic categories or analytic groupings that go a lot bigger if you take time to think about it. And again, think about how we could have a level of coding that's looking at sentiment analysis. Are people talking positively or negatively or neutrally about this topic? And we could have a layer of coding that's talking about do people fall within this broader bucket of what we expected to hear about versus what we didn't expect to hear about, and things like that. So there's all kinds of ways that you can take coding and apply it that go beyond just simple description of the data. And again, it's common to have a layer for sentiment analysis and another layer for keywords and another layer for ideas. Coding systems can get really complex if the researcher has sophisticated needs for analyzing the data. But they can also be really simple and focused on bucketing comments into broad concepts or applying some simple categories. So again, there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's all about trying to understand what you want to do with your data. Coding can be data-driven, which is built purely from the data, or concept-driven, which is built from hypothesis or expertise. And again, it can be inductive or deductive in terms of its framework, right? These methods are not exclusive, though, and they often work in tandem. And again, we want to be careful not to champion inductive or deductive approaches as being the right approach. It's all about what we're trying to learn and how we're trying to apply our data to our development of a broader theory. The key is to try to plan out our coding and categorization process before we have our data so we can apply an appropriate amount of rigor. And rigor is important because of the biggest criticisms of qualitative research. One is that there's not enough rigor in analysis. This is one reason why qual is often thought of as being a source of preliminary and directional insights, while quant is often used for validation and deeper understanding. But that's just one approach, and the truth is that qualitative research can be conducted with a lot of rigor if the research design specifies up front how the data will be dealt with and appropriate measures are taken to ensure that the data are being analyzed in a manner that limits subjectivity and focuses instead on producing findings that are valid, reliable, and repeatable. For a deductive approach, this often means knowing ahead of time what you're looking for and then assigning a research team to work independently and then provide together some support or refutation for your hypotheses or your theory. The problem, however, is the incentive for cherry picking to support a theory rather than conducting a more thorough examination of the data for deeper understanding. On the inductive side of things, this often means letting the conclusions arise from the data themselves and then assigning a research team to work independently and then together to provide their own system of categorization and or coding that can be compared and harmonized into a more robust system or theory. And one approach that we're going to learn about in this lecture series is called grounded theory, and it's something that's been developed within the social sciences to ensure that qualitative data can be accepted as credible and useful across the disciplines that have an aversion to qualitative lines of research. So, with all that said, that's been just a crash course and very quickly into coding and categorization. And grounded theory is itself a topic big enough to warrant its own section. So that is what we're going to talk about in our next lecture, how we can use grounded theory as an approach to qualitative data analysis.